The reason I feel uncomfortable is because I'm in the company of a great number of wonderful people, but two horrible words. These words are everywhere in the brochure, and some of them have even been attached to me. And they are my two least favorite words in the English language: communication and brand. Communication is a terrible, horrible idea. There's something awful about communication. I think speaking is fine, but communication? And brand has got to be the most dangerous word in the English or now the international language. It's interesting, the reason why these two words are so bad and so dangerous is because they are so imprecise. And before I start talking about Europe, I would just like to be a little bit academic for a couple of hours and talk about vocabulary, definitions, taxonomy. Ready? Communications is a word which masquerades as one thing, but in fact it's three completely different things, in my experience. Sometimes when people say communications, they mean information provision. Sometimes when they say communications, they mean advertising. And sometimes when they say communications, they mean propaganda. Those are entirely different things. Information provision is only possible when there is a demand for information. In other words, if the people out there have asked you for information on a topic about which they feel they need more information, and they have asked you to provide it, then the provision of information is legitimate, necessary, and arguably a duty. You also stand a pretty good chance of being listened to. Attempting to provide information when it has not been asked for on a subject that people are not interested in is quite simply a waste of money. And there is an approach to communications which was characterized by the Soviet Union, which is that if you notice that people don't think the right things about you, they must be ignorant. Therefore, there is an information gap. Therefore, you must fill that gap with information. I don't think that that's very sophisticated. Advertising. Advertising only works under two conditions. One, when you have a product or a service to sell, and two, when you've identified a consumer who might be interested in buying that product or service. Under no other circumstances does advertising work. Advertising is about selling. It works like information when you have the permission of the recipient to do it. Now, I'm a consumer, okay? I buy stuff. I receive an enormous amount of advertising messages. Frankly, I hate it. I've always hated it, but I tolerate it because I give permission to legitimate providers of services and products to use the media to tell me about the benefits of their product. I think it's an annoying but probably necessary function, because otherwise how do I choose? How do I choose between my Nikes and my Reeboks if I don't allow Nike and Reebok to pitch to me? I think that's fine. But it requires a product, and it requires an audience, it requires a market. Propaganda is an interesting one. Propaganda is something you do not when you want to give people information or they've asked for information, not when you've got a product and you've got a consumer, but when you want to change people's minds because you don't agree with what they think. You have no permission to do that. And for that reason, it only works under two circumstances. One, that you have unchallengeable authority, and two, even more importantly, you have absolute control over all the channels of information reaching your audience. Propaganda only works if it is never contradicted. And one of the wonderful things about globalization, the wonderful, exciting age in which we live today, is that propaganda has become impossible. It is simply impossible. It doesn't matter how much money you spend on telling people to change their minds, 100 million other voices will be saying the opposite. And your voice will be completely, totally, utterly lost. If I'd been giving this boring lecture 20 or 30 years ago, I'd be telling you that propaganda is evil. Today, with a smile on my face, I simply tell you it's impossible. Don't even try. So that's communications. Let me tell you about the European Union, in my view, at the risk of never being invited back. Most of what the European Union does is it provides information when nobody's asked for it, on subjects that they're not interested in. It does advertising when it has nothing to sell and it doesn't know who its consumer is. And it does propaganda almost all the time, despite the fact that it's patently a waste of money. But I'll come back to the European Union in a minute. Okay, you clap, so why do you keep on doing it? Brand. Brand is a tricky word. Brand is a word that ought to be banned. In fact, can I suggest that we ban it? We stop saying brand. If you really want to say the word brand, then be precise about it, because it's even more confusing than communications. It means three entirely different things, depending on which meaning you have in your mind. The first meaning of the word brand is brand image. What is a brand image? It's something I have in my head about your product. Yeah? It's my perception of your product. Brand identity is what my product looks like. Chaudfontaine, a little logo, a device, some colors, something I control absolutely. That's brand identity. And there's a third one, which you might call brand purpose. Let me just very quickly try to illustrate the difference between these, because it's not immediately obvious. Let me tell you a silly story. Imagine we have two airline companies, and they both decide that it's time to improve their brand image. So they both decide that what they need to do is they need to improve the product in order to improve their reputation, which is very good thinking. Yeah. And one of these airlines has got a very bad brand image, and one of them has got a very good brand image. The one with the bad brand image, I won't name an actual airline because one must be politically correct. Let's imagine that there's an airline from a little-known Central African Republic, which is only known because it's the poorest country on earth, and its national airline is called Plummet Airlines. Let's just imagine that the chief executive of Plummet Airlines decides that it's time to improve their brand because it's very bad. And so he calls together all his executives and he says, go out into the world and find out what the other airlines are doing and figure out why they've got such good brands and we've got such a bad one. And the executives go away and they come back after a few days, and the first one comes back and says, boss, I found it. And the boss says, what is it? And she says, the other airlines, the ones with the good brands, they don't crash. And she gets fired. And then the next one comes back a day later and says, boss, I've got it. And the boss says, this had better be good. And he says, oh, it is good, boss. He said, the other airlines, they have business class. And in the business class, they have flat beds. So you can lie down and sleep on a long flight. And the boss says, that's it. We're going to do the same, but because we're Plummet Airlines, we're going to go one better. And we're going to have double beds in our business class. And so a great deal of money is spent, and the aircraft are redesigned and rebuilt, and a huge advertising campaign, and there's a press conference on the day that the new business class is launched. And the chief executive of Plummet Airlines stands in front of the world's media and says, ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce that from this month you can fly Plummet Airlines' new business class and you can sleep with a friend. See if you can imagine what the reaction would be in the press conference. What's your reaction? Well, I don't know. My reaction? Horror. If it's an airline like Plummet Airlines, or some of the real equivalents that I have in my mind but am not mentioning, I don't want to sleep with a friend. I don't want to sleep at all. I don't want to lie down. I want to sit bolt upright in my chair with my safety belt fastened and my tray table in the upright position until we come into land, where I will stumble down the steps and kiss the ground because I'm so happy we've arrived. Now, that's the airline with the bad brand. Let's take the airline with the good brand. Let's take Virgin Atlantic. And let's imagine that Richard Branson, the charismatic boss of Virgin Atlantic, decides that he's going to do the same thing. And they're going to launch double beds in Virgin's upper class. Let's imagine the press conference. Richard Branson stands up with his beard and his woolly sweater, and he says to everybody, From next month, you can fly Virgin's new upper class and you can sleep with a friend. Now, we don't have to imagine that because it actually happened. They did it. I don't know why they stopped doing it, but they did do it a few years ago. And what was the reaction from the press assembled in the room? Delight. What a fantastic idea. How funky, how Virgin, how British. Where do I buy my ticket? You see, it is totally the opposite reaction to precisely the same message. And that is brand image. The brand image is not your message. It is the context in which your message is received. It is the prejudices, positive or negative, about which people, about you, which people have in their minds, and which they've probably had all their lives. Richard Branson would love to be able to get his little screwdriver and open people's heads and change what they think about his airline, but he can't. It wouldn't be legal even if he could. So immediately you realize that brand image, that perception of the airline, and think, it could be an airline, it could be a country, it could be a product, it could be a supranational region not a million miles away from here. Those perceptions exist, they're there, they're extraordinarily robust. And what the stupid anecdote about the airline tells us is that the brand image is not controlled by you. First of all, it's in a remote location. It's in the mind of the consumer, where you cannot go. Secondly, that location is secure. You can't get into it. And thirdly, it's fragmented. It's not one consumer, it's 100 million consumers, and each one of them has a slightly different view of your brand, your product, your country, your supranational region, depending on their own personal experience, their culture, their nationality, their level of prosperity, and so on and so on and so on. So that's brand image. Brand identity is completely the opposite. Brand identity is controllable. You spend some money, you change the logo. You can control it as much and as often as you like. You can get all kinds of clever, well-paid people sitting in rooms debating for hours on end about logos and slogans and advertising campaigns. Does it have any impact whatsoever on the brand image? Not usually. Not usually. That's the first confusion. And then brand purpose. What is brand purpose? This is a slightly more complex idea. I'll tell you another silly story. Many years ago, when I wanted to try and understand these things, I went to see Nike. It's a company in America that makes running shoes. And I went to talk to the marketing director, and I said to him, I wanted to understand what brands were. And I said to him, what's your brand? What is Nike's brand for Nike? And he said something rather surprising. He said, our brand makes it easier for us to buy office furniture. And I was a little surprised, and I said, what on earth do you mean? And he said, well, it's like this, Simon, he said. Before we had our brand, this Just Do It thing, I used to notice that in our headquarters building, and in fact all over the world, a lot of people wasted a lot of time making unimportant decisions. I would go into a room and I'd find 20 senior managers debating for hours about what kind of desks to buy for our offices. And the arguments would go on, and it was just personal taste. One person would say, well, I think the black one is funkier, and we're funky, so we should have a black one. And somebody else said, no, steel and glass, because we're modern, and we should have the modern one. And hours were wasted in this ridiculous round and round discussion, and nothing was ever resolved. And then he told me we hired an ad agency, and they came up with this slogan, Just Do It. We didn't know what the hell it meant. They told us it wasn't a slogan, it was a mantra. But it was meant to guide our behavior forever, and we thought that was kind of silly. But anyway, it was cute, and it performed well in research, and so we adopted it. And after a while, I discovered there were no more meetings about office furniture. And so I asked the chief operating officer what's happened, and he said, you know, it's a funny thing, but we've discovered that we don't need to have those meetings anymore, because anybody in the corporation, from the chief executive down to the man who cleans the toilets, can just open an office furniture catalogue and say, that one's the Just Do It desk. And I was rather surprised and rather interested, because it occurred to me, as it must occur to you, that a corporation is like a country. It's like a city, it's like a club, it's like a basketball team, it's like any combination of human beings. They will only get where they want to go if they all agree on where they're going and who they are. I think it was Napoleon who said, small armies can defeat very large armies if only their soldiers march exactly in step. No? So this is the point. Brand purpose is an internal thing. It's about everybody agreeing on where they're going and who they are so that they'll get there much sooner and much more effectively. Brand purpose, if you want a definition, is the art of getting lots of people to behave as if they were one person. Now, you can understand those three things are very, very different, but exactly the same confusion goes on with brand and branding as it does with communications. People think that the techniques used for the one can be adopted to produce the result demanded by the other. And many, many, many hundreds and thousands of hours and many, many millions of euros are wasted as a result of that confusion. And as for the word branding, I'll tell you about branding and then I'll get on to Europe. I'm sometimes accused of being the person who invented the phrase place branding or nation branding. It's actually a wicked lie. The phrase I think I might have accidentally invented, and I wish to God I hadn't, back in about 1998, was nation brand, not branding. And you may well say, what's the difference that 3 letters can cause? Well, it's an enormous difference. Because you see, when I said nation brand, I was just making a simple observation. We live in a globalized age where every country, every city, every region has to compete with every other for a share of what's going. What's going? Customers for their products, tourists, capital, the interest and the respect of the foreign media and of other governments. That's what everybody wants and everybody is competing for. In a situation like that, your reputation becomes everything. Because people simply don't know. The last time I checked, I think there were about 205 countries on the planet. How can we know anything about 205 countries? We can't and we won't. And you know what? Reverting back to what I said right at the beginning, we don't because we're not even interested. I've been doing an annual poll of how people around the world think about countries since 2005. It's called the Nation Brands Index. It's a very large survey of international public opinion about countries, measuring their images. And do you know what I've discovered? It's rather depressing. Most people in the world, not elites like us, but ordinary people, the majority, they only ever think about 3 countries. Their own country, a little bit, but not a lot. The United States of America, because it's kind of there, and it's relevant to almost everybody in one way or another, and much, much admired. And a third country which varies depending on who the individual is. It might be Chile because somebody's daughter has gone to study in Chile. It might be Turkey because somebody wants to go on holiday in Turkey. That's it, 3 countries. What that effectively means is that 203 countries in the world, at the last count, effectively do not exist for the majority of the world's population. Right? So my observation about brand, nation brand, was simply that in that kind of situation, your image, your reputation becomes far more important than the reality. And the sentence I used, and I wished I hadn't, was, consequently, governments today have to be brand managers as much as they are policy makers. The word I didn't use was branding. Branding is a lie. There is no such thing as branding. There's such a thing as good products and good marketing. Nike has a great brand image. Why is that? Is it because it's good at branding? No. It's because it's good at making running shoes and good at selling them. Many, many millions of people around the world have bought Nike shoes and have liked them and have learnt to trust the company that produces them. And that's where Nike's brand image comes from. They didn't do a thing called branding. What is a thing called branding? A thing called branding might be designing logos, but that's passive. That's just good housekeeping. That just makes you look professional. It doesn't win you any new customers. So my plea, that was the end of my academic lecture, my plea is, please, don't use those words anymore, at least not on their own. When we talk about communication, are we talking about the provision of information? And if so, the question is, have people asked for this information? Are they demanding it from us? If not, forget it. Are we talking about advertising? In which case the question to ask is, have we got a product and have we defined an audience that wants to buy that product? It may be free, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to cost anything. But it has to be a product or a service that we have identified reflects a need in the marketplace. Or are we trying to do propaganda, in which case, stop it. Branding. When we talk about brand, and we're going to talk a lot about brand during this conference, or rather you are, I'm off. Are we talking about brand image? In other words, the things that we can design, the logos that we can play around with and keep ourselves happy and make ourselves feel useful? I'm sorry, that's brand identity. Just checking to see whether you're paying attention. Are we talking about brand image, which is what people think about us, in which case it's uncontrollable, but we certainly have to measure it and understand it and see if it's changing in one way or another. And by the way, the image of Europe really is changing, and I'm going to tell you about that in a mo. Or are we talking about brand purpose, which is the really interesting one, and I would suggest the precursor to any form of good image? We have to know who we are and where we're going. So, images, the images of countries, the images of regions are extraordinarily robust. A lot of people are confused about this. A lot of people seem to imagine that they change from day to day. I had a phone call from a Finnish journalist a few months ago telling me that because one of the contestants in the global sauna competition in Finland had unfortunately died during the competition. And of course one feels very sorry for his family, but it was just very interesting because the journalist said to me, undoubtedly this has destroyed the image of Finland. My question to you, Mr. Anholt, is how long before it can recover, and what do we need to do? And I said to him, let me ask you a question. I said, you remember that episode a few weeks ago where an armed protester burst into the main courtroom in Accra, Ghana, and caused chaos for about an hour and a half. And it was a national scandal because nobody could get in or out. And they took a very long time before they discovered that he was holding a toy weapon. Now, no doubt that episode destroyed the image of Ghana for you. And there was a pause. And the journalist said to me, actually, I don't remember reading about that. And I said to him, right. And I don't remember reading about the Finnish sauna competition and the poor man who died. And by the way, neither do 99.999% of the other 7 billion people on this planet. So if you seriously think that everybody's thinking so hard about Finland that that's going to destroy its image, then you're sadly mistaken. If you really, really, really wanted to change an image here, you could engineer a contestant to die in a sauna competition every month for a year. And then maybe, possibly, you might slightly damage temporarily the image of sauna, but not of Finland. It doesn't work like that. So, on the whole, national images do not change. Still less do regional images because they're even bigger. I'm not saying that it's impossible to make them change, however. There is a way of doing it. But you may not be surprised to hear me say that it's got nothing whatsoever to do with communications and nothing whatsoever to do with branding. It has got quite a lot to do with who you are and what you do. Countries, regions, places generally, this is my staggering discovery after 15 years of researching this topic, places are judged by what they do and by what they make, not by what they say about themselves. I used to do a talk on this subject. I had to feel very brave to do it, and I don't anymore, but I would stand up on the stage in front of the audience, and for 10 minutes I would sing my own praises. I'd go up on the stage and I'd say, I don't know whether you noticed this, but I'm actually extremely good looking. And that's not by accident, by the way. I mean, lucky, because I was born this way, but I also dress very well. I've got impeccable taste. And I like to think that there's more to this than just choice. There's destiny, too. I mean, I come from a very, very old and distinguished family, and there's more to it than that, because, of course, there's education. I've been to some of the best schools on earth, and I have 3 degrees. And I'd go on and on like this, and the audience would be edging backwards in their seats, and some of them would be looking rather unwell. And after about 10 minutes, I'd say, thank you very much, that was nation branding. How does it make you feel? That's what nation branding is. It's when you stand up and say, I'm fantastic. What do you think when somebody does that? You think, what a loser, don't you? You think how terribly insecure this person is. Maybe his mother didn't love him enough. We admire instinctively people who seem sure of themselves. It's human nature that we cannot admire somebody who doesn't quite know how to admire himself or herself. And countries that waste millions of euros of their taxpayers' money publishing expensive lists of all the reasons why they ought to be admired should be in prison. That's no way to spend taxpayers' money. Countries are judged by what they do and by what they make, not by what they say about themselves. So here's a technique, if you like. It's not a technique, it's a description of what seems to work. First of all, and here let me talk about the European Union because it applies to the EU as much as to any country or city or region. First of all, you need to have a strategy. What is a strategy? A strategy says, this is who we are, this is where we're going, and this is what we're for. We live in an age of globalization, an age of gigantic, shared, common, planetary problems. Every country, every city, every region, every individual needs to be able to answer that question. What am I for? How do I earn my place on this planet? I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little judgmental here, but I feel this more and more strongly as time goes on. And we footle around, trying to solve smaller and smaller problems, simply in order to escape from the bigger and bigger ones that we seem unable to solve. So every place has to be able to answer that question. What am I for? What is my country for in the world? In 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, it doesn't matter. Why will people go to bed at night being glad that I exist? That, for me, is a mark of success. A great many people go to bed at night feeling glad that Europe exists. They really do. But perhaps we need more, outside as well as inside. So the strategy says that's where we want to get to, and this is how we're going to get there. The second element in the equation, which conveniently also begins with the letter S, is substance. There's no surprise here. If you want to become something, you have to be it. If you want a reputation, you have to earn it. So let's just suppose that the country I was talking about a moment ago, the national owner of Plummet Airlines, wants to be recognized as the country that solves the environmental problems associated with flying. Well, the substance is they have to do that. They have to invest whatever is necessary, time, money, skill, imagination, expertise, into becoming that thing, that substance. Now, the interesting thing is that you can have a strategy and you can perform substance, but it can still do nothing for your recognition. People might still not know who you are, and consequently you lose the benefit of that credibility, of that reputation. The third element is the one that's necessary: symbolic actions. Symbolic actions are the thing that works, unlike communications, which generally doesn't. Symbolic actions, unlike communications, are not talk, they are deeds. Condoleezza Rice used a memorable phrase a number of years ago: the diplomacy of deeds. It's the diplomacy of deeds that I'm talking about. It's policies, investments, innovations, real substance that is somehow intrinsically communicative. Things that people find extraordinary, but which are real, which are not just talk. When, for example, the tiny kingdom of Bhutan decided that instead of spending a lot of money on expensive tourism campaigns to beg rich foreigners to come and visit their country, they did precisely the opposite. They started charging a penalty to rich foreigners who wanted to visit their country. That was a symbolic action. That said, we're not coming to the world with a begging bowl. We've got stuff that you haven't got. We've got peace and wisdom and tranquility and gross national happiness, and we don't want to beg you to come here. You're the ones who should be begging to come to us. And actually, it was also very clever, because the kinds of tourists they wanted were very, very, very rich and very small in number. And if I know very, very rich people, they're very, very vain, and the one thing they cannot resist is being told that they can't have something. That's a symbolic action. Many years ago, when the Irish government decided that it was going to abolish personal income tax for anybody who could prove that they were a poet or an artist or a playwright or a composer, that was a symbolic action. It proved beyond any shadow of doubt that this was a country that respected culture, to the extent that it was prepared to map its fiscal policy against that belief. And it was a great story. It went round the planet in 24 hours. When Spain legalized gay marriage, it was a symbolic action. It had a political cost, of course, but it communicated, it proved beyond a shadow of doubt that this was no longer the Spain of Francisco Franco, that this was a modern, liberal, tolerant Western democracy. I guess what I'm saying is that the creativity which is needed in order to communicate with enormous numbers of people, to attract their attention, is wasted if it's simply exercised at the communications end of the process. Creativity only works when it's exercised at the development of policy. That's why on my business card, if I had one, I don't, it would say policy advisor, not communications advisor, because it's imaginative policy making, responsible but imaginative policy making, that really captures the imagination and works better. You see, there's a problem with civil servants and politicians. The problem with civil servants and politicians as a breed is this: They deal every day with incredibly serious matters. Very, very serious. The lives and livelihoods of millions of people depend upon their decisions. But they make the fatal error of believing that because their job is so serious, they also have to be boring. Actually, it is the most irresponsible thing on earth for policymakers and civil servants to be boring, because it's the boring policies that fail to grasp the imagination, fail to communicate themselves, and consequently fail to do any good. They then have to be imposed. You then have to use hard power rather than soft power to make them work. So imagination in policymaking is critical. For the European Union to become imaginative in its policymaking would require structural change, but then that's true for every government on earth. Governments deliberately exclude imagination in their work, most of them. They encourage their employees to believe that they should leave their hearts and their heads, the only organs that make us a special species, in the refrigerator at home when they come into work. And that's what's wrong. That's what's wrong. So let me finish. It's going to take me 7.5 minutes now, and I'm going to tell you what I think the European Union needs to do. Whenever anybody tells me that a country, a city, a region, whatever it is, has got an image problem, my immediate suspicion is that it's got a self-image problem. 99 times out of 100, when there's something wrong with the way the world perceives a place, it's because there's something wrong with the way that the place perceives itself. And one looks at the European Union, and actually, that doesn't look as if it's a bad diagnosis. The European Union had a very, very strong, clear, and almost universally shared sense of purpose when it was created. It was to prevent further destructive European wars. It did that. That's what it was for. And it did it so well that it gradually did itself out of a job. There are no more European wars. But what's left? A slight loss of that defining sense of purpose. That just do it, which enables us to buy office furniture instantly and without arguing about it. That sense that we're all in this thing together and we know why we're here, we know why we belong, we know what we're up to, and we know what Europe is for in the world. So supposing we wanted to redefine or recreate or identify the defining purpose for Europe for the next 50 years, well, it isn't very difficult at all. The answer is staring us in the face. We're so lucky. We live in an age where at least finding your role on the planet has never been easier. Because we are faced with enormous numbers of gigantic challenges, international, borderless challenges, which national governments are patently unable to solve. Most of those international challenges, if you gave me 25 seconds or I gave you 25 seconds, you could write down 25 of them without any difficulty at all. Human rights, women's rights, education, political and cultural intolerance, war, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change, economic instability, economic crisis, and so on and so on and so on and so on. We live in an age of gigantic challenges. Was it a Chinese proverb or a Chinese curse that said, "May you live in interesting times"? By heaven, do we live in interesting times? And what an asset that is to us all. Because we can just gain so much by picking on one or two of those and saying, that's going to be my one. That's going to be the one that I have the ambition, the consensus, the resources, the imagination, and the ability to do something about, to make a difference. Now, I've spent a lot of time wondering, in a casual kind of way, which one of those great challenges might be Europe's. And it's actually quite difficult to choose, because so many of them are all about Europe. Europe is implicated in most of them. Europe is largely responsible for a great many of them. Europe suffers more than anywhere else on the planet from many of them. Europe has more resources and capabilities to fix many of them than many other regions or other parts of the world. So which one do you pick? Also, Europe is quite a big beast. Do you just pick one? Or do you pick maybe 4? And then you prioritize them. And then you have a subcommittee to decide which one is going to be the priority for this 5-year session. No. It's starting to get confusing and muddled and bureaucratic. And having thought about this for a long time, I suddenly had a sort of a revelation, and I realized that all of those problems, all of those global challenges, huge as they are really only symptoms of one much greater underlying challenge. The simple fact that we haven't yet figured out how to run ourselves like a planet. The fact that most of those shared challenges, as I say, have been getting worse over the last 60 years. Most of them, not all of them. The fact that, well, we've created a global market, or the global market has created itself. And we've created a sort of, or we're beginning to create a sort of a global polity. Do we have a global society? No, we don't. And that's the imbalance. It's the differing speeds of development, the differing speeds of understanding that create so much turmoil. We desperately need to start laying the foundations of a global society. The institutions of multilateral governments that we inherited from our grandparents were designed in such a very different age, for such very different reasons. And one of the things I like to say is that reform of the multilateral institutions is probably tinkering at the edges. If you have a think about what the United Nations would look like if you were designing it in 2011, it would be inconceivably different. Totally, fundamentally, radically different from the one we've got today. So different that the idea of reform, to me, at any rate, seems ludicrous. It wouldn't be an institution to start with. It wouldn't be large rooms full of fat, bald old men in suits arguing about their national sovereign interests. It wouldn't be just governments. It would be all the stakeholders. It wouldn't exclude religion, because you can't these days. It wouldn't exclude corporations, because like it or not, you can't. It wouldn't be a body, it would be a network, because networks is how we operate these days. It wouldn't be top-down, powerful people talking down to weak people, because that's not the way the world works either. Survey after survey has shown that the only people anybody trusts is somebody like them. Bear that in mind. Next time you're doing a communications campaign, people only trust somebody who seems to be like them. So what's the answer? Well, to me it seems very obvious. The European Union is the only successful, partly, largely, experiment in multilateral governance in the history of mankind. It is the lab. It is the place where so many advances have been achieved. A bit of strategy, a great deal of substance, not nearly enough symbolic actions, but at heart, the place where the global governance, the planetary order, the global society is being forged. We are so much further along that road in the European Union than any collection of humans have ever managed to be before. Surely that is our gift to the world, and surely that is the purpose around which we have to organize ourselves. Stop talking, start doing, and with any luck, at the end, in 10 years, preferably a little bit sooner, people not just in Europe, but all around the world will go to bed, and the last thing they'll think before they drift off to sleep is, gosh, I'm glad that Europe exists. Thank you.